So you'll probably be getting a little pop-up that says it's being recorded. So welcome again. I am Jamie with the Conservation Foundation. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and use that Q&A box instead of the chat. The Q&A box lets everyone see your questions. It also makes it easier for me to find them all at the end. Questions can sometimes get lost in the chat, but we'll answer them at the end as best we can. For your safety, you should only be able to see what I post in chat, but just in case I missed a setting, please don't click on links other than what I may post there. As far as TCF housekeeping goes, these webinars are offered free to the public, but we do encourage you to consider a donation or membership. The more people we have attending, the more it costs us to run them. So at the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a page with a whole bunch of resources, things you might be interested in, further information to read up on, as well as our virtual tip jar. So if you're enjoying these webinars, I encourage you to donate to help keep us running. This will also make you a member so you can enjoy our wide variety of members only stuff. So welcome to Garden Week. Today we're going to be talking about organic gardening, and on Thursday I'll be back with Compost 101. We'll be talking about all things compost, how you can get your own compost system set up, what the different types of compost systems there are, and what does and does not go into a compost. So looking forward to that, and I hope you will join us again. On Monday, we'll be joined by TCF CEO Brooke McDonald, who will be talking about how to talk to your neighbors about conservation, regardless of your side of the aisle, regardless of how old you are, how old they are. There are some things that we all care about. So Brooke's going to be talking about our many, many years worth of polling data that we've done. And that's helped give us a picture about what people care about and how to talk about conservation with everyone. So with that, I would like to invite Connie to turn on your camera, your microphone, and join us. There you are.
Hi, here I am.
Hi there. So Connie, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Jamie. Oops, I'm knocking stuff over, sorry. I'm making background noise. I'm off to a great start here. I'm going to go ahead and right away share my screen with you all. And get going here. There we go. Okay, so it went back on me. There we go. So we are going to talk about organic gardening today. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited, as I was saying to Jamie before we got started, there's so much interest this year in particular, and just in gardening in general, and also with organic gardening, which is wonderful. So this is really a good thing. It's a great thing for me to see. I'm an environmental educator with the Conservation Foundation, but I've also been an organic gardener for more than 20 years. So hopefully I'm going to try to cram, 20 years worth of tips into, an hour, an hour or less. So hopefully I'll get you some good information here. But as Jamie said, feel free to ask questions. And then this is also my email on here, and Jamie's email is available also, so that you'll all have that, and you can email questions afterwards too if you think of something later on. So real quickly, if anyone is not familiar with the Conservation Foundation, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We've been around since 1972. We are proud to be accredited by the Land Trust Alliance, and our mission is to improve the health of our communities by preserving and restoring natural areas and open space, protecting rivers and watersheds, and promoting stewardship of our environment. So, to put that simply, we like to say we save land, we save rivers, and we work to improve the health of our communities. So organic gardening is a big part of all of those things. And since you're here today and you have an interest in organic gardening, I did want to just also quickly mention a few other opportunities for you. So the Conservation Foundation, the main location is at McDonald Farm in Naperville, which is a 60-acre working farm, and Green Earth Harvest has about 45 acres in production of certified organic produce, and we offer farm shares, which for this year are sold out, but definitely something to keep in mind for next year. And there are still opportunities to be able to get some of this wonderful local produce if you're close in the area. We'll be at St. John's Farmers Market, and we'll also have a roadside stand set up at the farm in Naperville. So I would encourage you to check out the website, theconservationfoundation.org, to get more information on the days and times for those. For those things. Our farm managers and farm crew do a phenomenal job of getting delicious, nutritious, local produce into the community. So definitely check that out. And then also, we're going to be offering some family adventures on the farm through June and the beginning of July. And so we're still easing into things. So we're keeping our social distancing, and families will get different time slots and get to come together. And we'll have some activities to do. There will be something led by an educator. There will be some self-guided little things and activities to do. And part of this is going to take place in the new children's garden on the farm that has some raised beds and some good examples of organic gardening practices. So that's definitely something fun to check out. It's free, but as always, like Jamie said, we'll graciously accept donations to help support our work. And we're also doing Nature on the Farm camps in July. And then in August at our Dixon Merst Farm location in Montgomery, Illinois, there will be a farm camp there also. Those are kids camps just for a few hours a day. So those are all really good opportunities to learn a little bit more, get the whole family involved, learn some more about organic gardening, and get some good organic produce. Because even if you guys are gardening at home, you might not be growing everything that you want to eat. So it's always great too to check out the farmers markets and, you know, add to it and get some more that way from the community. So let's see, I'm going to move my little window here a little bit. There we go. Talking about organic gardening, the first thing that we typically think of is food, which makes sense because there's a direct connection. So we've got, you know, we see if we were to use some synthetic chemicals like pesticides or herbicides and things in our garden, we're putting that on the plants and then we're harvesting from them and eating that. So we see that direct connection that, well, maybe if we don't want to put things that are harmful to insects or the plants, maybe we might not want to eat that either. Maybe that's harmful to us. So we see that direct connection. However, as I said, we save land, we save rivers, and so we're also trying to be conscious of our earth and take care of our land and keep our water clean and keep our soil healthy because that helps keep us healthy. So it's not just for veggies. So if you do other types of gardening too, if you have fruit trees and shrubs or even your landscaping, especially if you have edible landscaping, but any landscaping, your lawns, your flowers, your native plants, that can all be grown organically. So just something to keep in mind as we go through. I'm typically talking about food, but it applies really across the board to all of our gardening. And so I love this little sign here that says, if something is not eating your plants, then your garden is not part of the ecosystem. So if we just let that sink in and think about that for a minute, that's absolutely true. You know, people are so worried about wanting to keep everything away from the plants. However, we are trying to support a healthy earth and ecosystems and our wildlife, our birds, our insects, our pollinators, all of these things. So in order for it to be part of the ecosystem, it really needs to play a part. So something should be eating it. And, you know, of course, for our vegetable gardens, we would like that for the most part to be us, but you know, we can share a little bit too. So when we talk about organic gardening also, like I said, I'm going to be throwing a lot of things your way, a lot of tips your way. And thankfully, these webinars are available on YouTube also afterwards. So you'll be able to look back if you want, or, you know, refer back to certain points. I don't expect anyone to remember everything, you know, all at once. But these things here are things that no matter what, if you forget any of the little details, you can always just keep these general ideas in mind to help guide you in your gardening. So what are we doing with organic gardening? Why are we doing this? What are we trying to do? We're trying to grow with nature. We're working with nature and not working against it. A lot of times people's failures in their garden is for that reason. Nature will always win. So when we try to control it and, you know, just make it do what we want and we're not paying attention to what it wants to do naturally, we're setting ourselves up for failure. So let's work with nature, not against it. Let's observe nature and try to mimic the natural processes that we see. You know, we don't necessarily have to go out to the woods and take care of it every day. We're not dumping fertilizers and pesticides, and things just grow. They have a natural system. Everything is in balance, we hope, for the most part. That's, you know, they're invasive species and some things that we help out with a bit, but for the most part, it's not a high maintenance setting. And so we want to try to see what works in nature and how these things grow and thrive on their own, and try to mimic that. And that will make our jobs easier. So supporting our natural ecosystems and protecting our land and water. So if you ever get gardening advice from anyone and you're not really sure, you know, what's the best method, or should I do this, or should I try this? If you just keep these things in mind, does this seem like it's supporting the ecosystem, or that it could potentially be harming part of it? Is this something that would happen in nature, or am I trying too hard because I'm doing something that this wouldn't work this way on its own in its own natural system? So just keep those things in mind, and those will guide you and take you pretty far with organic gardening. So where do we get started? Now, I love that so many people have already gotten started. You're all, you know, a lot of you are already gardening, whether you're new to it or you've been doing it for a while. So when we're starting with organic gardening, where do we start? The first thing we want to try to do is, if possible, if we're starting from seed, let's try to purchase organic seeds. If we're buying plants, let's try to purchase organic plants. It is possible to buy seeds or plants that were not started organically, but we can still grow them organically for the rest of the process at home. But when you are able to buy those things, if you do and you're sourcing those things organically, you're supporting the systems that grew out the plants for those seeds, or grew the plants that you're purchasing. And so it's supporting, again, that going back to taking care of the earth beyond just us in our own yards, because you're supporting that whole system. So if you can do that, that's a wonderful thing to do. And so for sources, sometimes you will find in the garden centers, you'll find organic plants, organic seeds. Most home centers do have sections for organic seeds. A lot of them are not all that much more expensive than the regular seeds. So, you know, just do a little comparison shopping. A great thing to do to save money is to save seeds and start your own. And that's a little bit more information. There's a lot more information on that, but definitely if you can, buy organic seeds and organic plant starts that are already started for you, that's a great start. Also, McDonald Farm Green Earth Harvest did have a plant sale too. So even if you're not local to us in Naperville, Illinois, hopefully there's a place near you where you can get those types of things. A lot of times Master Gardener programs will have plant sales, and that's a good source as well. But definitely keep us in mind for next year for the plant sale to get some good organic vegetables that have already been started for you. I bought a few from this year and they were beautiful. So the next thing that we want to talk about is what to grow. You know, it seems some of this is kind of obvious. For example, here I've got this picture of oranges and strawberries. We know oranges don't grow in Illinois, for example. We can grow strawberries. That's not a problem. But it's really important to try to grow things that want to grow for you, to think, you know, grow things that want to grow in your space. So it's not just about climate like the oranges, but also smaller areas and microclimates. When we're growing things that naturally want to grow in our garden space, we're saving on all that extra support we need to give these plants. So they don't need as much in terms of pesticides, water, fertilizers, because they naturally will do well in that area anyway. So that can get right down to different areas of your yard. Maybe things will grow, different things will grow better. So if you have a moist area, that might not be the best area to grow carrots, for example, because as a root vegetable, if they're sitting in damp soil, that can, you know, too damp, like kind of mushy and wet, then that can rot the roots and you won't end up with good carrots. But something that really loves a lot of water, like cucumbers, would do well. That's full of water. You know, you slice into it and it's that good hydrating summer vegetable that we like to grow and add to our salads and just snack on it. And it's full of water. That's kind of a hint that it does absorb, it needs water from the ground. So cucumbers might do well in more of a wet spot that you have, but carrots might not. And also I mentioned on here, elderberries, that's another thing that likes damp areas. So just as an example. And then I'm kind of picking on carrots today. If you have heavy clay soil, think about how a carrot grows. They want to go deep down into the soil. And if it's hard and, you know, or really rocky, if it's rocky, you may have a wonky looking wavy carrot because they're trying to grow around the rocks in the soil. And if you have heavy clay, it just might not get very far. So it needs a looser, deeper, you know, good organic type of soil. And when I say organic there, I'm talking about in terms of the organic matter in the soil, organic matter being anything that at one point was alive, the leaves and, you know, any grass clippings that may be in there, anything decomposing in the soil, your compost that you've added, all of that. So something that would do better in a heavier clay soil might be a cabbage, lettuce, Swiss chard. So it's really important to pick things that automatically want to do well, rather than planting something that isn't necessarily going to thrive in that space and then feeling like you have to dump a ton of fertilizer and things on it because it's just not doing well and you're trying to give it a boost. So other examples are if you have an area in your yard that has a little bit of light shade, maybe something like a lettuce would do better, but not necessarily something like tomatoes that want that full sun. If you have an area, maybe you're starting a newer section of your garden and the soil might not be the best and you're working on, you know, hopefully a few years from now, you'll have a much better soil to work with. But if it's a brand new garden space that maybe used to just be grass or just was kind of not the best area, maybe it would be better to grow something like beans, which don't need that much and actually add nitrogen to the soil, rather than trying to grow something in that area like broccoli that's a really heavy feeder, meaning it wants a lot of nutrients from a good, rich soil. So just choosing your plants wisely for the space and for your area and your climate is very important. Now, as I mentioned, we're not just talking about our vegetables. So this is another good reason for when we're trying to keep our vegetables organic, the rest of our yard can benefit as well. If we do not treat our lawns, if we can avoid treating our lawns, you can use the grass clippings from mowing your lawn, and then in the fall, as the leaves are falling, you can rake those up or you can mow them with your mower and make a leaf mulch. And you can use those things in your garden to mulch your plants. So your vegetables, if you put the grass clippings all around, adding that mulch around your plants reduces weeding. You're creating a barrier. You're helping to maintain the moisture level. So that also makes weeds easier to pull when there are weeds that pop up. And by reducing the weeds that are popping up, you're reducing the need for herbicides, you're reducing your need for watering. So you're making a more low maintenance garden for yourself, which is always helpful. These things, as you're putting them on, also act as like a slow release fertilizer. So if you lay grass clippings around your plants, that's not like a miracle grow, you know, boost of nutrients, but that grass had nitrogen in it. And as it breaks down, it will be slowly adding that to the soil. It's going to be also giving food to the worms and adding organic matter for that soil food web. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. So Jamie mentioned on Thursday, she's going to be doing a webinar about composting. I highly recommend that. This is another very important part of organic gardening. One thing with fertilizers, that is tending to be, like I mentioned, it's like a jolt, like a big boost of nutrients for the plants. It's kind of a fast, instant gratification kind of a thing, but it's not really always a long-term solution. Whereas compost is, and that will create healthier soil in the long run. So by adding compost, we are feeding the microorganisms in the soil. And what that does, the microorganisms in the soil actually are what is making the nutrients available to our plants. So just to put it simply, they're breaking that down part way so that the plants can uptake those nutrients. And then we then in turn eat those vegetables that we've harvested that now have more nutrients in them. They're healthier plants, and that's healthier for us, but also the healthier plants are more resistant to pests and don't require as much pesticide use, if any. So I definitely recommend that. And composting is a bit of an art. It's science and art. So definitely good to learn more about that and how you can use that in your garden. There are misconceptions sometimes that, a lot of times when I talk to people about composting, they don't understand why it's not, doesn't seem to be working for them, but they tend to be only using their kitchen scraps, and they're not, they don't have the full mix with the nitrogens and the carbons. So definitely a good thing to learn more about that and be able to use some good organic compost in your garden. It also is helping to close those loops, so that rather than bringing in all kinds of inputs, you're using things that you already have and putting them back into the system. So that's a wonderful added bonus as well. So speaking of fertilizers, compost is sometimes mistaken for, a lot of times people think that it is a fertilizer. It does have nutrients, but they're typically lower level nutrients. And as I said, it's more about feeding the soil so the soil can feed the plants. So if you want to add other, boosts of nutrients to your plants, a good way to do that is by using other plants. So there are some things, like I mentioned, beans can actually add nitrogen to the soil. Those things are called nitrogen fixers. So there are plants that will actually take atmospheric nitrogen right from the air, and they make it available in their roots to the other plants around them. And so typically it's things in the beans and pea family. So these are good for enriching your soil. So things like beans, baptisia, and clover, those are all good. Clover is a great ground cover as well, and it's also what's called a green manure, which has nothing to do with manure that we typically think of. It's more of, it's like a cover crop that you can grow. It's low growing, and then you can either turn it into your soil or just chop it down and leave it in place, and that adds some of those nutrients back into the soil and adds organic matter again for the soil food web to help have healthier soil, which makes healthier plants. So another type of plant you can use as a fertilizer is a group of plants that are sometimes referred to as dynamic accumulators. Those plants typically have a long taproot, and so they're called miners. Some people refer to them as miners. They dig deep down into the soil. Rather than having a shallow root system going this way, they have a deep taproot that goes down and can really pull up a lot of minerals. And dandelions are one of those things. They do have a high mineral content. And so if you are, again, you're not treating your lawn and, maybe you've got a few dandelions that are popping up and you want to go and dig those up, you can toss those right into your compost pile, and they can be considered a compost activator, and they're high in nutrients and minerals. So they add some of that into your compost. And other plants that are commonly used are comfrey and borage. Borage is a great plant. That's what's shown here on the lower right. Bees love it. It grows quickly and large, and you can actually chop down pieces of it and use what's called the chop and drop method. You chop down pieces of it and you can lay it down under your other plants as mulch. Again, as it slowly decomposes, it adds nutrients back into the soil on the surface. But while it's doing that, it's acting as that mulch, creating a weed barrier and suppressing new things from coming up, and also helping to keep the soil moisture so it doesn't dry out too quickly and have, especially in the heat of summer, you go and water your garden and then it all evaporates and it's dry again very quickly. So having that mulch in there really helps with that. Lamb's quarters are another thing. A lot of times people are pulling them anyway as a weed. They are edible, and a lot of people like to eat those. It's an edible weed. It's very similar to spinach, and it grows in the middle of summer when spinach typically doesn't do well because it likes cooler weather. But if you're pulling them anyway, lay them down on top of the ground. Now you have to be careful if they're going to seed. You maybe don't want to lay that down. So if you get them sooner, get them earlier, lay them down or add them to your compost pile. those are ways to get some of those nutrients that they're pulling up from the soil and adding it back to the soil, but in a different way. Another thing that's commonly used for that are nettles, so stinging nettles. Again, this is a very useful plant. They have all of these plants that I have pictured here are very useful, but because nettles are stinging nettles, a lot of times if they pop up in an area you don't want them in, that's a great opportunity to be able to take those, cut them down, pull them up, whatever it is you want to do to get them out of the space that you don't want them in. And you can actually soak them in a big jug of water and let it kind of turn itself into a tea, and it pulls a lot of those nutrients out of the plant. And then you can use that to water your plants and get those nutrients, that little vitamin boost where you do want it, give it to the plants that you want to have it. And so the nettles, I was going to say something else about that. Yeah, I don't know. I forgot what I was going to say. I'll go on. In terms of, all I was going to say was the idea behind that is just like how different vegetables that we eat have different nutrients in them, and spinach or kale might have different nutrients than an apple. Different plants have different nutrients. So there are certain ones that if you're not using it for something else in the garden, but it's full of nutrients, it's just a great way to add that back into the system. So another thing we want to do in organic gardening is, in this process of trying to limit or eliminate the herbicides and pesticides and things that we're using, we need to find other ways sometimes of getting those things. So again, instead of a synthetic fertilizer, you can use those plants. Instead of using herbicides, honestly, the best thing you can do is prevention. As they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If you can take care of weeds while they're small, that really helps to eliminate the need for herbicides. So it's much easier to prevent the weeds from coming up to begin with than it is to try to take them out afterwards. And so one of my favorite tools is what's shown here on the lower left. That's called a stirrup hoe. It's got a nice long handle. There are different sizes and different kinds. And that bottom part is kind of like a blade. And so you just kind of go back and forth like you're mopping the floor, and it just, when the weeds are tiny, it just cuts them off at the surface. And if they sprout back up, you cut them off at the surface. And so it's a really easy way to control the things before they get too big. And then it's a lot of work to get rid of them. So catching them when they're small, using the right tools for the job, those things are very helpful. Trying to prevent them to begin with, using mulches, using tools like this to get them when they're little. But then also we can create weed barriers. Aside from just the mulch, you can put even underneath your mulch, use a biodegradable weed barrier. You can use cardboard, you can use newspaper. It's important to not use really shiny cardboard, or like the ads that you get, sometimes grocery store ads or magazine type ads that come in the little free flyers. You don't want to use the really shiny stuff. Those sometimes have heavy metals in the inks, and it's a different type of, that's just something we don't want to be adding to a garden, especially a garden we're going to eat from, but really any area. So you want the dull, plain black and white newspaper. Most of those are printed with vegetable-based ink and should be okay. When in doubt, you can always research further for your particular source. And then cardboard. In the picture I have here, what this person is doing is called sheet mulching, and that's doing a large area, which is great if you're starting a new garden, new area of the yard that you want to convert to garden space. Sheet mulching is a great way to do that without breaking your back with a lot of digging. So that's putting down the barrier, and can't really tell in the picture, but she's putting it down right on top of the grass. It's going to smother that out. She'll put all kinds of things up on top of that, compost, you can add topsoil, you can add, plant material, those grass clippings and leaves that I mentioned, all of that. And then you can do this in the fall and then let it sit over the winter. And by springtime, a lot of that will be breaking down and you'll be able to start planting right in there. And then usually wood chips would be used on top of that. You can use straw in your garden area. Wood chips are really good for shrubs and trees. You can use them in your garden as well. A lot of people get nervous about that or don't want to use them because of the issue with locking up nitrogen in the garden. And so what that is about is when wood breaks down, it requires nitrogen to be able to break down some of that wood. So it will lock up the nitrogen so it's not available to the plants because it's busy being used up in that decomposition process with the wood chips. However, if you're only using the wood chips on the very top surface as a mulch and you're careful and you're not mixing it into the soil, you really shouldn't have an issue. And it actually, over time, it really creates some nice soil underneath there. Yeah, so I don't have an issue with using wood chips as long as it's only on top and you're just careful to not mix it into your soil at all. And another thing you can do to help eliminate herbicides, we really want to keep the ground covered. So I'm talking about mulch and weed barriers and all these things, but you can also do that with living plants. We just don't want to leave bare soil. If you leave bare soil, you're creating an opportunity for weeds to come up. You know, nature abhors a vacuum type of a thing. If you're leaving an empty space, something's going to fill it. And so if you control what fills it, you'll be better off. So if you can use a living ground cover, like I had mentioned, clover being good for adding nitrogen and adds organic material if you cut it and leave it there on the soil and let it break down in place. Also, alyssum is another one because it's a very low growing little flower. It's great for pollinators and it's great for attracting beneficial insects. And because it's such a low growing flower, you can plant it right in and among and between your vegetables. You just sprinkle the seeds across the soil, and then when you water your vegetables, you water that and it grows up in place, and it just creates a nice living mulch that helps keep weeds down. The space is now filled, so you're not giving opportunity for a lot of weeds to pop up. And so without giving them the opportunity to grow to begin with, you're saving yourself from having to try to get rid of them after the fact. So some other options that you can use, in place of herbicides would be, this is going back to how my grandma did this, boiling water. I remember she used to get a kettle. So this can work in places where, you know, you don't want to pour boiling water on your vegetables that you are trying to grow. But again, in terms of our whole area, our whole property, if you have, for example, weeds coming up in a crack in the driveway and maybe it's hard to get or hard to pull, you can pour boiling water on them and eliminate them that way. You can still pull them out afterwards, but it kills them. It will kill the roots. And that's one pretty easy solution that avoids using the synthetic herbicides. Vinegar is another thing. You've probably heard of making solutions with vinegar and soap and, you know, different additives and things. What that's really doing is changing the pH. So what will happen sometimes is it might immediately kill whatever particular weed is there, but then after a few weeks you might see a completely different type of weed sprouting that actually like the change that you just made in the pH level of that area of the soil. So that's something to keep in mind. And there are commercial herbicides that are a much stronger, it's basically vinegar, but a much stronger solution than what we would typically buy in the grocery store. So that is, you know, a more natural method. Salt is another thing. If you think about it, if you've got plants growing along the edge of your street or your driveway, and then in the winter they come through and salt, and maybe some of your plants didn't survive, well, you could use that to your advantage. And some things can be killed with a saltwater solution. And then also, I kind of like this one, flame weeders. A flame weeder is basically a torch on a handle that you can use to go and before, like if you're prepping a bed before you plant it, anything small that's coming up that you don't want there, you can go through and torch it, maybe wait a couple days, see if a new round of things sprout up, do it again, and then your bed will be prepared so that you can then plant into it, hopefully with much less weed pressure than you would have had at the beginning. And a lot of times too, which I notice, and people get discouraged at the beginning thinking that this battle with weeds is just never ending. But I only really have an issue with weeds in my newer garden areas, which is kind of all the time because every year my garden beds get a little bit bigger. So every time I expand into a new area, that's typically the area that I'll need to weed for this year, next year. But all of my existing garden beds, I really don't have much to do to prepare those beds because I'm using mulch, because, you know, all of these things that I've been doing work together. And over a period of a few years, that bed becomes established and the weed seeds are kind of gone. That seed bank has been, you know, most things have popped up in those first few years and I've taken care of it and eliminated a lot of that. So they don't tend to really give me a lot of weed pressure. It's basically only in the newer areas. So if you can get through those first couple of years, you know, might be a little bit more work on controlling some of the weeds, but after that, hopefully not. Hopefully it's a little bit more smooth sailing and you can kind of coast through that a little better. So another way we can eliminate, so aside from herbicides, but to eliminate our pesticide use in the garden, a big one that we hear about often is companion planting. And so there are a few different things that, a few different reasons why this works. And there are all kinds of different recommendations for different types of plants to use. I feel like some work better than others. Some I haven't had a whole lot of luck with, but other people swear by. And so it does kind of take a little bit of experimentation and see what works for you. But the idea is that when you're companion planting, when you intermix plants, rather than planting, say, an entire row of tomatoes all together, if a pest comes in, for example, this hornworm on the lower right, pest comes in and wants to eat your tomatoes, all of your tomatoes are all lined up right there, and it can just go from one to the next and work its way down the line and get all of your tomatoes. But if you are intermixing, and there are different garden methods that do this. If you look at like a potager type of a kitchen garden, those mix flowers and herbs and vegetables all together, fruit trees, everything all in one space. That type of system actually works really well. It helps to confuse pests because you're not laying it all out there on a platter for them. You're kind of mixing it up, so they might find one, but they might not find all the rest of your plants of that same type. So it does kind of confuse them. It creates barriers so that they don't just have easy access, like I said, to all of that one particular type of plant that they like, whatever particular pest it is. And then plants themselves have their own different qualities that help this work sometimes as well. Some plants are natural repellents, things like onions and garlic and chives, marigolds, nasturtiums, and really anything that has a really strong smell, strong smelling aromatic herbs. So things like dill, cilantro, oregano, a lot of times those things work really well as repellents. Some of those actually work not just for insects, but for other animals as well. Rabbits, typically a lot of times people will plant chives, onions, garlic around their garden beds to prevent rabbits from getting in because they don't really like those things. So it kind of, you know, that strong smell keeps them away and deters some of those types of pests as well. And then other types of plants that we use in companion planting are attractants. So they're things that will attract insects, but the ones we want. So there are beneficial insects that will help eat other pests in the garden. So some of the attractant types of plants are listed here: cilantro, dill, yarrow, fennel. A lot of those are those very ferny looking types of plants, and some people are familiar with those attracting swallowtail butterflies. They attract other beneficial insects as well. So other plants like tansy, coreopsis, cosmos, alyssum, which I already mentioned, feverfew, and chamomile. So some of those have other uses also. They're beautiful. You can make tea with some of those. You've got culinary herbs. So they serve more than one purpose in the garden. But these things will attract the insects that will help do part of that pest control job for us, so we don't need to rely on pesticides. So what we've got pictured here at the bottom, that's a lacewing. We've got ladybugs, and then on the right, that hornworm, those little white things on its back, there are bracconid wasps, which are teeny tiny. They're non-stinging, very small little wasps, and they come and they actually use the caterpillar as their host to reproduce. So they, you know, lay their eggs, and the larva that actually eats it will kill that caterpillar. So if we can, as I mentioned before, watch those natural processes and control our urge to need to try to control everything in the garden, if we can just let the system establish, let those little ecosystems develop, and let nature have a chance to do what it wants to do on its own. It can save us a lot of work, and it can save us the need to use a lot of chemicals. So, and I've seen this process. It's very difficult. If you see a hornworm, they can do a lot of damage to a tomato plant fairly quickly. So the temptation is to go around and just pick them all off and, you know, look for them. People will go out with black lights, and I'm not saying don't do that. By all means, go for it. But if you miss a couple, chances are those little braconid wasps will take care of them for you. So just let nature have a chance to act on this. Ladybugs, people are usually familiar with ladybugs in terms of eating some pests like aphids. They also will eat flea beetles, and that's something that a lot of times, well, in my garden, it has attacked some of the cabbages and kale. It's attacked, I've had flea beetles. Last year it was on my eggplants. So they pop up in my garden sometimes, and so I want to do everything I can to attract the insects that will eat those things and do that job of pest control for me. So another thing we can do to eliminate pesticide use is to use a physical barrier. So this picture that's shown here, there's insect netting, or there are row covers that you can purchase, or you can make these. You just want to make sure that it doesn't have holes big enough for the insects to get through. So this would work really well if you're trying to grow things like broccoli and cabbage, anything, those brassicas, the brassica family, where they tend to get a lot of damage from cabbage worms. It's those little white butterflies that you see, those pretty little white butterflies that fly around the garden. And then when they land on your plants, though, they lay their eggs, and their little baby caterpillars will decimate your plants. So if you can use the insect barrier like that to keep the butterflies out so they're not laying their eggs in there, very helpful. That goes a long way with the things that get attacked by those particular things. Now that wouldn't work necessarily as well with something like flea beetles, because those tend to be in the soil. There's certain things that covering them is just going to keep them in. But for specifically cabbage worms, this will help a lot, to have an actual physical barrier to keep those butterflies out so they can't come in and lay their eggs on your plants. And then, as I mentioned, you can always go through and remove some of these pests by hand. It's not my favorite job by any means, but it's definitely effective. Not only with like the hornworms, some of these larger things, the cabbage worms, you can go if you find them. It takes a good eye to find them because they blend in really well, but then you can remove those by hand. And that definitely helps a lot in controlling the insect population as well. So in terms of picking off a lot of those, and I should say too, I've done that before with Japanese beetles where I've collected them, but I have backyard chickens, I have hens, and so I can kind of collect those and then I go feed them to them and they get rid of them, or I let them roam in the yard and they'll take care of a lot of them on their own. So that's an important thing to consider, is letting, again, we're, in addition to insects that can come in and do some pest control for us, let's try to attract wildlife to our yard that can help us as well. Diversity equals resilience. So the more different helpers we can attract to our space, again, we're trying to support these ecosystems and set up a natural system that can help to sustain itself. And then that eliminates our need to have to add all these things and do all this extra work. So if we can attract things like frogs and toads in the garden are wonderful. They eat slugs, they're really helpful. They eat crickets, all kinds of things. If we can attract birds, particularly bluebirds and wrens, they love to eat insects. And so there are particular birdhouses and things that you can add to your garden that will attract those specific things. And that's very helpful. Spiders. Okay, now, again, I said I don't like to hand pick the insects. It's not my favorite thing. I don't, I share the space. I don't mind it, but every once in a while you'll turn around, and if you've ever seen one of these big garden spiders, the yellow and black ones, I know those tend to scare the heck out of people, especially if you're newer to gardening and you haven't seen one. It's a good sign though, if you have those, please give them their space. There's usually a big female, and then you'll find some little smaller webs, little around the female where the males will be. They're much smaller spiders. They are fantastic helpers with pest control in the garden. So very good to have. And then snakes, again, I know a lot of people, you know, don't love that idea, but they're so, I personally like them a lot, and they're very beneficial in the garden, and they do eat a lot of the small pests. So sometimes even things like mice or field mice that will attack your seedlings when they're small and attack your plants a little bit, and right down to things like crickets. And so they're very beneficial as well. So attracting wildlife is always helpful. If you're attracting the right kinds, you don't want to attract, you know, deer that are going to come eat your whole garden, but we want to, you know, maybe protect some plants from some wildlife, but we definitely want to invite other wildlife. And so I mentioned I have backyard hens. That's another way. If you're in an area where that's allowed, they are fantastic at pest control. And some other things you can do are crop rotation. So sometimes we think of crop rotation only in terms of the nutrients in the soil, and we don't want to grow the same thing in the same place all the time because it might just be, you know, using up the same type of nutrients and depleting the soil in that area. So if you rotate and you plant different things, you know, in rotation in that space, then that's beneficial for the soil. It's also beneficial in terms of pests and eliminating our use for our need for using pesticides. Because if you have something growing, for example, squash tend to get attacked by squash bugs very commonly. That's another thing that you can go and just manually I always say, squash the squash bugs. You want to go out and just squash them. When you find the eggs on the leaves, either get rid of that leaf if you can, or, you know, do what you can to keep those under control because they can destroy your plants. Squash vine borers also are awful, but the squash bugs are very common. And if those are in one area this year and you know you're having a big problem with it, you can plant them in a different spot next year, and hopefully the pests don't always keep up. That doesn't always work, but it does sometimes. It's just one more tool in your toolbox. Another thing I like to do is use decoys or trap crops. One example, I mentioned Japanese beetles. We have, I had some smartweed pop up in my yard before, and I actually like it. I think it's pretty. I think sometimes people think anything with the word weed in it has to go. I'm a little more lax on some of that, and I think they have pretty little flowers, and I left it alone. I wasn't in a big hurry to pull that or get it out of the space. I was so glad I left it there because I accidentally discovered that the Japanese beetles loved the smartweed. That was fantastic for me because they swarmed that, and then they left my flowers and my raspberries alone. So if you can use any type of a decoy or a trap crop, sometimes it can even be the crop you want to grow, but you know maybe that the first round is going to attract all the pests, and then you can gather them all up and eliminate them in any way possible, and then hopefully plant your next round that won't be attacked as much if you've used that first round as a trap to collect all the pests that are attracted to it and destroy them or get rid of them. And that also leads me to another tip, which is to adjust your planting dates. So sometimes there are pests that are more active or more prevalent at different times during the season. So speaking of Japanese beetles, those tend to come around a little bit later. They're not usually an issue in the earlier part of the season. So there are different pests. You can do like succession planting as well. So if you plant, speaking of squash bugs, you plant some squash, and as soon as that starts flowering, then you plant squash seeds, so that by the time the one is done growing, if you are sick of battling things like powdery mildew and squash bugs, you'll get some vegetables, and then if they start not doing so well, you tear them out because now your new set is starting to grow. And a lot of times that second round won't be affected by the same insects that first round was affected by. So either adjusting your planting dates or using some succession planting things a couple weeks apart. Those are some other ways that you can avoid some pests and then avoid your use of pesticides then. And then so finally, I wanted to go over when you're doing all of those things, and I'm talking mostly about natural methods and things that you have on hand, things you can do, without having to purchase a lot of things. There are also, when you do go to purchase certain products, so if maybe you've got a new raised bed and you want to fill it with some good raised bed soil, or you're adding some compost, or you do want to actually purchase a pesticide or an herbicide, but you want an organic one. What do you look for if you're trying to buy organic products? The big thing is this symbol that's up here on the screen that says OMRI listed for organic use. When you see OMRI approved products, it's kind of like going to the grocery store and seeing that something is certified organic or certified naturally grown. They've gone through this process. OMRI stands for the Organic Materials, I want to say Research Institute or something, actually, no, Review Institute, I think, and I was just looking for that symbol. And so that tells you that this product meets the requirements and the specifications, that these are the things that actually can be used in certified organic production. So those should be safe for you to use. And then, of course, you can make your own, like some of the things I already mentioned. Garlic, you can smash garlic and soak it in water and use a garlic spray to keep pests away, because again, it's that strong smell that a lot of times will deter those certain pests. And then you can also purchase pesticides or herbicides that are considered organic, but I do have to say, and I made a little note on there, still use these sparingly, if at all. Just because it says it's organic doesn't mean it's okay across the board to just, oh, it's organic, so I can just dump this all over my garden. Not really. So as an example, I've got neem oil listed on here. That's an oil that's made from a plant. There's a plant called neem. And so it's a naturally derived oil. And it does help eliminate some pests and kill some pests. That's great. BT, which is used a lot for soft-bodied insects, like those cabbage worms I was talking about, that's actually a bacteria that when those caterpillars or soft-bodied insects in particular, when they're eating that, it damages them internally. So it can cause paralysis, and so it kills them. However, a lot of these things, when you use them, they're not specific to one certain type of insect or pest. So if you're trying to kill cabbage worms, you want to be careful you're not also maybe killing your monarch butterflies. Now, they're going to be, your monarch caterpillars will be on milkweed and not on your, cabbage, but typically. But it's just the idea that these things are indiscriminate. So they won't just kill the one thing that you have your eye on. It may kill other things too. And we are trying to support the ecosystem and not cause harm. So diatomaceous earth is another example. Diatomaceous earth, if you're not familiar with that, it's made of diatoms, which are, so it's fossilized plankton actually, and it's very sharp. It's a powder to us, but really you shouldn't breathe it in either. Just be careful. It's very sharp, fine particles. So soft-bodied insects that crawl over that will get cut up, and so it kills them that way. However, it can also, if you're sprinkling that in your flowers, your bees that we're trying to save might be crawling through that. And so you just still have to be careful. Even though something is labeled organic, let's just, do a little research and see if there are other things we can do, and just try to not go at it with an all-in attack, unless that's needed. And sometimes, unfortunately, when we feel like we're losing the battle, it can seem that that these things are needed, and sometimes they are. So, but it's just the idea that even if you're using an organic product, let's try to use them smartly and sparingly if possible. And I just thought of another plant too that has worked really well for me, since I mentioned a couple. 4 o'clocks apparently deter Japanese beetles as well. So I mentioned the trap crop, that smartweed that attracted them, so it kept it away from my other plants. 4 o'clocks actually deterred them. So planting 4 o'clocks around my raspberries has seemed to keep the Japanese beetles off of them. Someone else gave me that tip and I tried it and it actually worked wonderfully. And another one this year, I'm going to be planting my eggplant in the middle of my catnip because I have had a couple people swear that the catnip plant deters those flea beetles that I mentioned, and they were attacking my eggplants last year. So I'm going to try that. So lots of different things to play with and experiment with. You know, for me, I prefer to do that before I resort to, you know, purchasing something that might harm other things aside from the one thing I'm trying to take care of. So just some of those are some tips there. So I'm going to go back to this, and I wanted to make sure I left enough time. Yep, we've got, so just right before 2 o'clock here, I wanted to make sure that we have time for questions.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We do have a few questions here. So, Connie, I'm going to go ahead and just read these off to you then.
Okay.
Susan wanted to let us know that the St. John's Farmers Market's been canceled for 2020. So,
okay.
it's a bummer.
Yeah, I hadn't seen
a
that
lot of them
update
are,
yet.
But
okay, thank you.
Jennifer wanted to know if you have any thoughts on milorganite.
Well, not specifically. I don't really have anything one way or the other, as in swear by it or don't use it, or not really. I'm kind of neutral on milorganite. It's another tool, but yeah, I don't know. Did you have a specific question about it or just general thoughts? I don't really have any, you know, one way or the other that I would avoid it, or that I would, you know, that I can say that I have had great success with it.
Okay. Mark wants to know, is cut grass good to put on your garden after you cut it?
Yes, as long as your yard is not treated chemically. You know, if you're using herbicides or pesticides in your yard that you don't want in your vegetable garden, then I wouldn't use those clippings. But if your yard is untreated or treated organically, or you know, if you feel safe using it, then absolutely, because it does add, again, it can be used as a mulch, and it adds some nitrogen back to the soil, and it's adding organic matter to the soil.
Okay. Sarah says, our local landfill has a composting system, but 90% of it looks to be trees that are being ground up. People are bringing in lawn clippings, leaves, etc., but most is trees being ground and put into piles to compost. What's the nutrient value of this organic matter?
As it's breaking down in the compost, so typically if you're getting compost from a commercial facility, and they generally will have reports available that shows the nutrient content, which is very helpful. Typically, it's not going to be the same as a fertilizer. Like if you're looking at your NPK, your numbers are going to be pretty low. Compost is really more about feeding the soil food web, feeding those microorganisms, than feeding the plants. So again, if it's a commercial composting facility and they may have a higher nutrient level, because a lot of times they're also selling that compost to farmers and gardeners, and so they are actually trying to do that. But if you're doing a backyard compost, if you were to do the same nutrient tests, you may have a lower level of nutrients. Again, those microorganisms are eating up a lot of those nutrients as part of that process of breaking down all of that organic matter. So long term, any compost is good because you're adding to that soil food web, and you are making the nutrients in the soil available to your plants, but the compost itself isn't adding a big boost of nutrients up front. It's more of a long-term solution than an immediate boost, if that helps.
Okay. Mary wants to know, does lead in newspaper ink leach into soil and contaminate plants?
Yes, and that's why we want to make sure that if you're using newspaper, you want to make sure you're using the ones that are a vegetable-based ink, and not it's typically the shinier newspaper ads that have those heavy metal, and some toxins in there. You can usually verify from your source. For example, if you get the Chicago Tribune or whatever the paper is, you should be able to verify from the source what they're using and whether it's safe or not. If you're not sure, then I wouldn't use it. But that's just a general rule of thumb, is that the shiny ones, the really colorful shiny papers, are not good to use. And generally the black and white, for the most part, not always, those are generally vegetable-based inks and are safer. So yeah, definitely know your source. I wouldn't just toss anything in.
Okay. Another question asks, when should we use organic pesticides, as prevention or only once we see pest damage?
My personal opinion on that is only if it's needed. So I use more of the natural methods like the companion planting and all these other things as prevention. But inevitably, you know, and every year is different. You might have a pest that pops up this year that you didn't have last year, and that just is really attacking. And so, you know, then if you need help from an organic pesticide, then that's when I would turn to it. But I don't usually go in with that first.
Okay. A couple specific questions about getting rid of slugs and flea beetles.
Okay. Slugs in particular, my favorite slug control method is toads. But also, you know, a lot of people swear by the method of putting out a little saucer of beer and then it attracts the slugs to it. And then you can just get rid of that, you know, dump it in the mornings. Like you put it on the soil or on the mulch underneath your plants and attract all of the slugs to it that way. Depending on where you live, this doesn't apply to everybody, but if you're in a place where you're allowed to have ducks love to eat slugs. They are fantastic slug control. So yeah, my favorite methods are just encouraging the animals in the garden to take care of those things for me. Snakes, toads, you know, things like that. Even opossums will eat slugs. And they typically don't do a lot of damage to the garden, which, you know, which is good. They can, but they don't typically, especially toads and things, they're not really going to damage your plant. They're all about the slugs. But otherwise, I would use some of those organic methods. Like you can use some of the diatomaceous earth. That's really good for soft-bodied insect like a slug. Or, you know, use the little beer in a saucer method and attract them and then just get rid of them. You know, collect.
Are they more on like the PBR side, or are they more craft things?
I think they're not probably too picky. You probably don't need to go fancy microbrews or anything. You can just, you know, yeah.
Just checking.
Exactly. Anything you have is great. And then flea beetles, that's another thing too. Diatomaceous earth is helpful. This year I'm going to be trying, like I mentioned, catnip. I'm planting my plants that last year really you know, the flea beetles seem to be attracted to, which were my eggplants. I'm going to plant those in with the catnip because people have been swearing that works. I've heard that from a few sources, so I'm going to try it. I don't know if that will work or not, but that's going to be my next, the next thing I try. So I'm definitely all about experimenting and seeing what works for you and what doesn't. Because like I said, sometimes like I might say something like, you know, people swear by the beer in a saucer method for slugs, but you might try it and your particular slugs, maybe they are picky and prefer to microbrew and they don't want to go in there. You know, but I would definitely try it because it doesn't hurt anything. It's easy. And then you can, if it doesn't work, then try something else. You can handle.
Marisol also says she's heard that ground coffee around the plants can help prevent slugs.
Yeah, I would agree with
that.
that.
And I know a lot of times you can go to your local Starbucks and they were giving away, you know, big bags of their used coffee grounds for coffee.
Yes, yeah, and that can actually be a little bit of a nitrogen source too. Sometimes typically if you're going to use coffee grounds in the garden, you want to use them after you've run the coffee pot. So you're using the used grounds, which is what you would pick up from the, you know, from the cafe or Starbucks or wherever you're collecting from. But it might be a bit too strong in the garden to just put out fresh coffee grounds. They're a little bit acidic. They're a little bit, you know, it's a bit more, if you're using it for slug control, I would just use your used coffee grounds.
Okay, and I'm going to throw out there too, because I'm seeing a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
We generally don't provide the slides after webinars. However, this was recorded. It will be uploaded to our YouTube channel in about a day. So this webinar, as well as all of the previous webinars, I've been doing these now for, I don't know, 8-10 weeks, however long we've been doing the whole stay-at-home thing. I've been doing these live webinars. So they're all recorded and all on our YouTube channel. So if you're looking for If you want to share it with somebody, if you want to watch it again, if you missed part of it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, and everything is loaded up there. Okay, so my cucumbers are already being eaten to lace leaves. Suggestions?
The first thing I would suggest is to try to see what is eating them, because that will determine what your solution is. So if you know what's attacking them, then you can then plan your plan of, your counterattack kind of based on that. But for cucumbers in general, one thing in terms of companion planting, again, this isn't 100%, it's just one tool in the toolbox. I like to plant nasturtiums with all of my cucumbers, squash. They typically help with some of the pests. They deter some of the pests that like those plants, not 100% though. So then you can also follow up with something like, you could do, I'm trying to think of what would typically be attacking the cucumber. You could do diatomaceous earth, but again, you want to avoid any of the flowering areas. You don't want to put that where your bees are trying to get in and pollinate. So you just have to be careful with your application. And one way to do that is to use like an old Parmesan cheese container, and you can put it in there, and then it's got the little holes, and you can kind of sprinkle it, or like a spice jar, and then you have a little bit more control over where you're applying it rather than a broad all over the place and getting it everywhere. The other thing too with a lot of these is then if it rains, you have to reapply. So keep that in mind as well. You might need to, follow up a couple of times, but the best thing I would say is to find out what is attacking them and then see what you need to do to control that particular pest.
Okay, couple more. Do you use compost tea? Do you have a good recipe?
Compost tea is wonderful. The thing that a lot of people miss there is that to keep those microorganisms active, if you were to just put compost in water and let it sit for a long time, if it's not at the correct temperature, if it's not aerated, it will get stagnant. You end up with an anaerobic situation there, and it'll just get stinky and not as good quality. So compost tea is generally used in about 24 hours. So a simple, easy recipe is just to take finished compost, like from your compost pile, and then soak it in water and let all of that get in there. Basically, it's a way to take maybe this much compost and spread it across a broader area. By mixing it with water, you're making it go farther, you're extending the area you're able to cover. But really, again, any kind of compost, that's more about adding those microorganisms to the soil to help break things down and make nutrients available to your plants. It's not so much about adding a big nutrient boost necessarily. So you just want to make sure that the way you process that compost tea, that you're not killing those microorganisms, because that's kind of the point. So you don't want it to get stagnant and old, so it's got to be used fairly quickly, like within 24 hours of mixing it with that water. Otherwise you need to keep a bubbler in it, and it gets to be more work. But aside from a compost tea, you can do the same thing with certain plants like comfrey, nettles, where you're making a tea, and that's more of a fertilizer tea, because you're really pulling those nutrients from the plants and all of those minerals, and then applying that broadly as like a foliar spray, as fertilizer for the ground. You just add it to the water when you're watering, and that will add more nutrients.
Okay, what do you recommend to deter pests from roses?
So roses and garlic are really good friends. So if you can plant garlic or any type of anything from the onion family, chives, garlic, onions, even some of the ornamental alliums, if it's got, that oniony smell, that tends to deter a lot of pests that attack roses. So those would be the first things. And then if you have, again, particular things like if you have aphids, then you want to also be trying to attract your ladybugs and your lacewings and beneficials that way too. So depending on the type of pest that's attacking them, I, again, try to plan the plan of attack based on that. But just in general, garlic and roses are very good friends.
Okay. Is there a resource to find plants that attract or deter pests?
Yeah, there are several books that touch on that. And of course, doing a Google search might come up with some good results, and maybe some iffy ones. You might have to weed through some of that. Some of it is kind of just, you know, I don't want to say old wives' tale, but some of it is just more people's stories and anecdotal than actually scientific. And that's why some of these things might work for you and some might not. One book that I like, it's called Gaia's Garden, and it actually lists out plants that can be used for different purposes, like nitrogen fixers or dynamic accumulators or things that attract beneficial insects or pollinators. It's a really good resource that kind of lists things out. That's spelled G-A-I-A, Gaia's Garden. It's by Toby Hemingway. There are several other ones too. There's a book, Carrots Love Tomatoes. There are quite a few books about companion planting, but specifically I thought of Gaia's Garden because that one has so many different lists broken down for you already that, that list all those different purposes.
Okay, Melissa says, I'm newer to gardening. Before I knew not to, I planted my potatoes next to my cucumber seeds. Should I dig up the potatoes and replant elsewhere?
Potatoes and usually the best companion plants for potatoes are beans. And also that's another one that I like to plant alyssum with, just as a ground cover in between the potatoes. You know, if it's right next to your cucumbers, I honestly, I wouldn't really worry too much about digging them up. They shouldn't hurt each other horribly, but just, you know, if you have something you want to plant in between, like some kind of flower, that's great. Some things really don't do well with others, like fennel is notorious for not growing well with other plants, but some things it's kind of like, well, it might not be ideal, but they shouldn't really cause you big problems. Especially if they're not intermixed and planted right in the same bed, but they're just kind of next to each other. And you still have time to plant some nasturtium and things around your cucumbers, and that could help a little bit too. I wouldn't worry about digging it up, but I mean, if you want to and you have the space and, you know, sure, it's not going to hurt, but I wouldn't worry too much about that.
Okay, comfrey fertilizer. Does that liquid need to be diluted with water before applying?
Depends on how strong you're making it. So if you have like a lot of plant material in a bucket with just a little bit of water and it's really strong, sure, then yeah, you can dilute that probably into maybe 2 or 3 buckets before you disperse it. But you don't have to. It's not so strong that it's going to burn your plants. It's not like bat guano, for example, or like a chicken manure that's a really high nitrogen and can actually burn some plants. You won't have anything like that. It shouldn't cause you any damage. But it'll go farther if you want to dilute it a little bit. So, you know, just as needed, whatever you think is appropriate for how your plants are doing and how much of a boost they need.
Okay. Let's see. How can I get rid of ants in my garden? I'm trying powdered sugar and baking soda mix and sprinkled on it. Or how about vinegar and soap?
So a lot of times when I hear people ask about getting rid of ants, I always wonder why. Just because, and I know they can be sometimes excessive, but sometimes just people want to get rid of things just because they're there. So that's always my first question is, are they causing damage? Are they causing an issue? Because if not, I wouldn't worry too much about it. You can use cornmeal. Honestly, I think sugar like just feeds them. And some people would use like borax or cornmeal or, you know, things like that to help control them. If you have peonies nearby or plants that typically attract ants, I would think about that too, because if that's the case, so peonies actually help to open those flowers, and the peonies need the ants, but they also are attracting the ants. So if you have something like that nearby, it really doesn't matter what you do to try to get rid of them, they're going to come back. So things like that I would consider as well, like what's growing near there. But another thing too, if you get right down to it and you have like a big, you know, there's a big issue with ants in the middle of your garden that are causing problems, again, get out that tea kettle of boiling water, and you can pour boiling water on their ant hills too. Doesn't sound like a very friendly thing to do, but it's effective, you know. So that would be another suggestion to try.
Okay, and I think this is gonna be the last one. We're about 15 minutes over, so can adding cow or chicken manure make for better soil composition, that is after sitting?
Yes, and yeah, you're correct. It does need to sit. It needs to be aged. If you are again, I mentioned chicken manure is pretty high in nitrogen, so definitely you want it aged and composted. And another issue with using any type of manure in the garden is pathogens. That's why we avoid things. We don't use manure typically from like carnivorous animals at all. You know, we don't put dog waste in the garden, things like that. But if it's an herbivore, like a cow, or then typically, or even a horse, typically the only issue you have there is, you know, if it's from a source where they have had a lot of antibiotics given to them, like horse farms and things, I'd be careful. If there are a lot of weed seeds from the straw or hay, you know, that they're bedding in or eating, things like that can come up. But if you, and I don't know if, Jamie, if you touch on the difference between hot compost and cold compost on Thursday, but cold compost doesn't necessarily kill the weed seeds and the pathogens, and a hot composting system would be a better bet if you're aging the manure. But then once that's done, absolutely, it's a good additive to the garden, and especially if you put it on in the fall and then wait and you're not planting until the following spring and you're giving it just that extra amount of time. You do like a top dressing and then let it age even further over the winter after it's been composted. You should be safe, and it is a good additive.
All right. So I apologize if we didn't get to your question, but thank you all for joining us today. Please feel free to send us an email if we weren't able to get to your question. We're more than happy to answer questions outside of the webinar. So thank you again. This will be posted up on our YouTube channel, usually within a day or so. So again, thank you. And we hope to see you back on Thursday for more composting chat. So
thank you so much,
everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.